I've been thinking about as well, this idea has become more credible to me the longer I've developed it, the longer I've thought about it. You know, the idea that there's, I'll go back. It's partly the idea that, well, let me figure out how to start this properly. Friend of mine, business partner, and a guy that I've written scientific papers with, very smart guy, took me to task, and I think I told you this a little bit, about using the term dominance hierarchy, which might be fine for like chimpanzees and for lobsters and for creatures like that, but not for chimpanzees even so much. And he said something very interesting. He thought that the idea of dominance hierarchy was actually a projection of a early 20th century quasi-Marxist hypothesis onto the animal kingdom that was being observed. And the notion that the hierarchical structure that you see that characterizes, say, mating hierarchies in chimps, for example, the idea that that was predicated on power was actually a projection of a kind of political ideology. And I thought, that really bugged me for a long time when he said that, because I'd really been used to using the term dominance hierarchy, and I thought, he told me all that, and I thought, ugh, that's so annoying. It's so annoying, because it might be right, and it took me months to think about it. And then I was also reading Franz de Waal at the same time, and he's a primatologist, and also Jack Panksepp, who's a brilliant affective neuroscientist who unfortunately just died. He wrote a great book called Affective Neuroscience, and for rats to play, they have to play fair or they won't play with each other. And that's a staggering discovery, right? Because anything that helps instantiate the emergence of ethical behavior in animals and that associates it with an evolutionary process, which is essentially what Panksepp was doing, gives credence to the notion that the ethics that guide us are not mere sociological epiphenomenal constructs. They're deeply rooted. If rats, and they're rats for God's sake, you can't trust them, and they still play fair, you know. And de Waal noticed that the chimp troops that he studied, like it wasn't the barbaric chimp that ruled with an iron fist that was the successful ruler, because he kept getting torn to shreds by the compatriots that he ignored and stomped on. As soon as he showed some weakness, they'd just tear him into pieces. The chimp leaders that were stable, you know, that had a stable kingdom, let's say, were very reciprocal in terms of their interactions with their friends, and chimps have friends, and they actually last for a very long time, chimp friendships, and they were also very reciprocal in their interactions with the females and with the infants. And I thought Franz de Waal is a very smart guy. And I thought that was also foundational science, because it's really something to note that the attributes that give rise to dominance in a male dominance hierarchy, sorry to use that word, let's call it authority, that might be better, or even shudder competence, which I think is a better way of thinking about it, is that that's not predicated purely on anything that's as simple as brute power. And I think too, you know, I think as well that the idea, and this is a deeply devious and dangerous political idea in my estimation, the idea that male hierarchies are fundamentally predicated on power in a law-abiding society, I think all you have to do is think about that for like a month, say, which isn't that long, to understand how absurd that is, because most people who are in positions of authority, let's say, are just as hemmed in by ethical responsibility, or even more so, than people at the other levels of the hierarchy. And we know this even in the managerial literature, because we know, generally speaking, that managers are more stressed by their subordinates than the subordinates are stressed by their managers. And that's not surprising. You want to be responsible for like 200 people? You really want that? That's hard work, man. And I mean, I know it's a pain to have a boss, because you have to care about what the boss thinks. And maybe the person is arbitrary, in which case they're not going to be particularly successful. But it's no joke to be responsible for 200 people. And you have to behave very carefully when you're in a position of responsibility and authority like that, because you will get called out if you make mistakes constantly. So it's not like because you have a position that's higher up in the hierarchy that you're less constrained by ethical necessity. Now, if you're a psychopath, well, that's a whole different story, but psychopaths have to move pretty rapidly from hierarchy to hierarchy, right? Because they get found out quite quickly. And as soon as their reputation is shattered, then they can't get away with their shenanigans anymore. So, okay, so all of this is to say that there is something very interesting about the pattern of behavior. So imagine that imagine that sexual selection is working something like this, and we know that sexual selection is a very, 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 very powerful biological force, even though biologists ignored it for almost 100 years after Charles Darwin originally wrote about it, thinking mostly about natural selection. They didn't like the idea of sexual selection because it tended to introduce the notion of mind into the process of evolution, because it deals with choice, you know. But so imagine, on the one hand, that you have a male hierarchy. We know that the men at the top of the hierarchy are much more likely to be reproductively successful than the men at the bottom. That's particularly true of men. So you have twice as many female ancestors as you have male ancestors. I'm not going to do the math, and I know it doesn't sound plausible, but you could look it up and figure it out, and it's perfectly reasonable fact that it actually happens to be true. So you have twice as many female ancestors, because females are twice as likely, on average, to leave offspring as men. Now what happens is, any man who does reproduce tends to reproduce more than once, but a bunch of them reproduce 0. Whereas, so it would be the average man who reproduces has 2 children, and the average man who doesn't reproduce has 0, obviously, and the average woman who reproduces has 1 child. So that means that there's twice as many females in your line as there is males. So that's a big deal. And so imagine that it works something like this. So the men elect the competent men who are admired and who are I can't say dominant, who are given positions of authority and respect. Let's put it that way. And it's like an election. Now, it could be an actual democratic election, but it's at least an election of consensus, or it's at least an election of, well, we're not going to kill him for now, which is also a form of election, right? It's a form of tolerance, you know. So, and then what happens is the women, for their part, peel from the top of the male hierarchy. And so you've got 2 factors that are driving human sexual selection across vast stretches of evolutionary time. One is the election of men by men to positions where they're much more likely to reproduce. And the second is the tendency of women to peel off the top of male dominance hierarchies, which is extraordinarily well established cross-culturally. Even if you flatten out the socioeconomic disparity, say, between men and women, like they've done in Scandinavia, you don't reduce the tendency of women to peel off the top of the male hierarchy by much. And why would you? I mean, women are smart. Why in the world wouldn't they go why wouldn't they strive to make relationships with men who are relatively successful? And why wouldn't they let the men themselves define how that constitutes success? It makes sense. Like, if you want to figure out who the best man is, why not let the men compete, and let the man who wins, whatever the competition is the best man by definition. How else would you define it? So, okay, so why am I telling you all that? Well, the reason is because it seems to me that there's been this complex interplay across human evolution between the election of the male dominance hierarchy and sexual success. And that's a big deal if it's true. It could be, because what would happen, you see, is that as men evolved, they would evolve to be better and better at climbing up the male hierarchy, because the ones who weren't good at that wouldn't reproduce. So obviously that's going to happen. But then it wouldn't just be a hierarchy, because there's a whole bunch of different hierarchies. And so then you might say, well, are there commonalities across hierarchies? That's a reasonable thing to propose. I mean, they're not completely opposed to one another, at least. If you're relatively more successful in one hierarchy, then it's more probable that you'll be successful in another. And that's actually a really good definition of general intelligence, or IQ, and that's actually one of the things that women select men for. Now, men also select women for that, but the selection pressure is even higher from women to men. And general IQ is one of the things that propels you up across dominance hierarchies, because it's a general problem-solving mechanism. And the other thing that seems to do that to some degree is conscientiousness. And there's also some evidence that women prefer conscientious men. So, and of course, why wouldn't they? Because you can trust them, and they work. And so those are both good things. So then you think, okay, so men have adapted to start to climb the male dominance hierarchy, but it's the set of all possible hierarchies that they're adapted to climb. And so then you think there's a set of attributes that can be acted out, that can be embodied, that will increase the probability that you're going to rise to the top of any given hierarchy. And then you could say, well, that as you adapt to that fact, then you start to develop an understanding of what that pattern constitutes. And so that starts to become the abstract representation of something like multidimensional competence. And that's like the abstraction of virtue itself. Well, and none of that's arbitrary, man. That's as bloody well grounded in biology as anything could be. And I think that's a really hard argument to refute. And like one of the things I should tell you about how I think is that when I think something, I spend a long time trying to figure out if it's wrong, because I like to hack at it from every possible direction to see if it's a weak idea, because if it's a weak idea, then I'd rather just dispense with it and find something better. And I've had a real hard time trying to figure out what's wrong with that idea. It seems to me that it's pretty damn solid. And then the idea that, if you watch what people do in movies and so on, and when they're reading fiction, it's obvious that they're very good at identifying both the hero and the anti-hero. We could say the anti-hero, generally speaking, the bad guy, is someone who strives for authority and position, but fails. Generally speaking, not always, but fails. So he's a good, bad example. You take a kid to a good guy, bad guy movie, the kid figures out pretty fast that he's not supposed to be the bad guy. And figures out very quickly to zero in on the good guy. And that means that there's an affinity between the pattern of good guy that's being played out in the fiction and the perceptual capacity of the child. And one of the things I told my son when he was a kid, when I used to take him to movies that were sometimes more frightening than they should have been, but one of the things I always told him was, I never said don't be afraid, because I think that's bad advice for kids. What I said was keep your eye on the hero, right? Keep your eye on the hero. And he was gripped by the movie and often quite afraid of them, because movies can be very frightening. So he'd just zero in on that guy and hoping, and you know what it's like in a movie, you hope that the good guy wins, generally speaking. And why do you do that? Where does that come from? You see how deeply rooted that is inside you. You'll bloody well go line up and pay to watch that happen. It's not an easy thing to understand. And it's so self-evident to people that we don't even notice that it's a tremendous mystery. And so is it so unreasonable to think that we would have actually, over the millennia, come to some sort of collective conclusion about what the best of the best guys are, best of the good guys are, and what the worst of the bad guys are? And to me, archetypally speaking, thinking of that as the hostile brothers, so that's Christ and Satan, or Cain and Abel, for example, very common mythological motif, the hostile brothers. It's like those are archetypes. It's like the Satan, for example, is by definition the worst that a person can be. And Christ, by definition, this is independent of anything but conceptualization, is by definition the best that a man can be. Now, as I said, I'm speaking psychologically and conceptually, but given our capacity for imagination and our ability to engage in fiction, and our love for fiction, and our capacity to dramatize, and our love for the stories of heroism and catastrophe and good and evil, I can't see how it could be any other way. So that's part of the idea that's driving the notion of the evolution of the idea of God, and even more specifically, driving the evolution of the idea, at least in part, of the Trinity. So God is an abstracted ideal formulated in large part to dissociate the ideal from any particular incarnation or man or any ruler. And there's another rule in the biblical stories, which is that when the actual ruler, I mentioned this before, when the actual ruler becomes confused with the abstracted ideal, then the state immediately turns into a tyranny and the whole bloody thing collapses. So the idea is so sophisticated. One of the things that we figured out, and this was a hard thing to figure out, was that you had to take the abstraction and divorce it from any particular power structure, and then think about it as something that existed as an abstraction, but a real thing, right? Real in that it governed your behavior, in everyone's behavior, including the damn king. The king was responsible to the abstracted ideal. Man, that is such an impossible ideal. Why would have they agreed to that 5,000 years ago? But one of the things you see continually happening in the Old Testament is that as soon as the Israelite, for example, the Israelite kings become almighty, the real God comes along and just cuts them into pieces, and then the whole bloody state falls apart for hundreds of years. It's I think that's a lesson that we have not thoroughly, consciously yet learned. It's still implicit in the narratives. We still haven't figured out why that's the case. Well, again, I think that's a real hard argument to dispense with. So